Let's go live now to Seattle, where we can speak to Dominic Gates, who's the aerospace reporter for the Seattle Times. Dominic, thank you so much for your time. First of all, I just wondered what your reaction was to what we've been hearing about Ethiopia saying those early findings on the Ethiopia Airlines crash are showing clear similarities with the Lion Air crash.
Well, the latest news isn't a surprise because over several days we've been finding out about similarities between the crashes. What they have now is the full flight data from the black box, and that's just cementing and solidifying the idea that there are similarities. But we'd already seen the first 3 minutes, the flight trajectory, that looked similar. And they found a piece of the plane that moves the horizontal tail. It's called the jack screw. And the position of that jack screw in the wreckage indicated that the tail had been in such a position as to point the nose down. These things were all pointing to similarities with the Lion Air crash. So unfortunately, yes, now the full data is becoming available, and we're seeing that there may be a common cause.
Now, you've yourself have been looking into how the 737 MAX was approved. Can you tell us a bit about your findings of that investigation?
Sure. Well, we had a front page story this morning because I looked into the certification of the system that is now suspected as potentially causing both crashes. Basically it's a piece of software that was inserted to move the horizontal tail in a certain extreme case of a high-speed stall. And because of a faulty sensor, it is understood that in the Lion Air crash, that system activated repeatedly and brought the plane down, forced the nose down. The pilot struggled against it and eventually lost. It now looks like the Ethiopian plane may have been something similar, possibly a faulty sensor again, triggering that system. So what my story looked at was, how did the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration here in the United States, how did they certify this system? The whole plane has to get a certificate, a type certificate, that it's safe to fly. Well, I spoke to sources within the Federal Aviation Administration and former people who had worked on the document, and a system safety analysis was done on that specific system, on all the systems that move the horizontal tail. And this system that's suspected in the crashes, this new part on the MAX, was part of that system safety analysis. That analysis was done by Boeing. It was delegated by the FAA to Boeing itself, and they produced a report which my sources identified pretty serious flaws in that analysis.
So what we're talking about is essentially self-regulation. I mean, has Boeing or the FAA come back to you on this and defended themselves about their approach?
Well, not in response to this story. In fact, they really didn't respond to the details at all. But you have to understand that this delegation of the work to Boeing is actually the way it's done now. The FAA delegates a lot of the work to Boeing employees. There are Boeing employees who are appointed. They're called authorized reps, authorized representatives of the FAA. So they work for Boeing, they're paid by Boeing, but they report to the FAA. The FAA doesn't have the funding and the resources to do this. It's been taken away over the years, and they've been told by Congress to delegate as much as possible, unless there's some safety reason why not to. In other words, the onus is on those with a safety concern to pull it out. Otherwise, it gets delegated to the industry itself, in this case, Boeing.
So can you tell us just briefly what you found might have been wrong with Boeing thinking this system was safe, if indeed it isn't safe?
Well, the document that assessed the system safety had we identified the sources within the FAA, and people who had worked on it identified 3 shortcomings. There was an inaccurate limit stated in the original document about how much the system could move the horizontal tail. That limit was quadrupled later on during flight tests, but it looks like it wasn't communicated to the safety analysis team at the FAA. Also, perhaps even more important, the analysis that was done by Boeing didn't take account of the fact that the system would reset itself every time when it forced the nose down and the pilot countered it by using the trim switches on the control column. It would kick in again immediately afterwards. And on the Lion Air flight, it pushed the nose down 23 times before it finally crashed. Now, the analysis did not take account of that repeated multiple applications of the system.
Just briefly,
and then finally,
oh yes, go ahead.
One other very important thing, it was triggered by a single sensor, and that sensor was faulty. And the system analysis included a failure, an analysis of what a failure would do, and that analysis concluded that this was so hazardous, it was technically labeled a hazardous failure, and that should have precluded the system being triggered by one sensor.
I just want to jump in because I'm sorry we're very short of time, but I have to ask you very quickly about the news we're hearing that there's going to be some sort of investigation by the US Department of Transport into the FAA's approval of the 737.
Right, yes, I just heard that myself tonight. Yeah, well, the evidence I've seen is that this design wasn't safe. Boeing itself seems to be admitting that now because it's creating a software patch to fix exactly the three things I just talked about. It's going to be triggered by two sensors, not one. It's going to limit the amount it can move the tail. It's not going to operate multiple times. Boeing has said and told legislators now that that's what it's going to do to fix it. To me, it's almost an admission that those were faults in the system to start.
Dominic Gates, aerospace reporter for the Seattle Times. I'm so sorry we've run out of time, but thank you so much for your analysis. And Boeing is obviously continuing to investigate what happened in the Ethiopia Airlines crash.